I am, like you said, going to be talking about criticality in the food and ag sector, kind of from a Department of Homeland Security perspective. Everyone in this room that's eaten knows how critical food is, but we're trying to tell the story about food as an infrastructure, and that's a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. Also, the state level assessments of the different, and when I say sector, I'm talking about like beef from farm to table, or poultry from, genetics all the way through eggs through retail. And when I mention a subsystem, I'm talking about a different part of that chain. And the subsystem might actually be a facility or the land and the livestock itself. A subsystem could also be the grain mills. It could be complex food creation, and it could even be the transportation in between those components, which would be the lines represented here. And so obviously all of you know this is a very complex system, and it's difficult to assure quality and safety, as we just have heard in the presentations this morning. But from a protection standpoint, there are additional provisions that we need to look out for, because defending the food system is kind of a new hot button issue that we really need to start considering. Just some terminology. I will be using kind of the FDA's food protection model that came out in 2007 as far as food safety and food defense together equal food protection, and that's the goal and kind of what we'll be talking about today. There were some initial terminology, I think even in this session they call it food security. My background in health and international development, WHO considers food security the ability to feed your populations. So Haiti right now is having issues feeding their population or securing food for their populations. So we try to move towards the food defense terminology and food protection. The additional challenges with food protection as a whole, as many of you already know, we have increased global sourcing of feeds and food ingredients, all sorts of different things. These obviously raise safety concerns, but there's also protection concerns that need to be considered. An example with this is melamine. It was an intentional additive. It was done for economic gains, but if it was done for harm, it still would have shown up, as a protein in nitrogen testing and things like that. There are varying best practices from state to state, as you just mentioned with eggs. There are kind of different rules for different places. Different states that we went to, operate their cattle systems differently. We looked at Kansas and Missouri back to back and found that their operations were set up quite differently. So when we've been doing assessments in all the states, we like to say if you know one state, you know one state, and the food system doesn't always stay within one state. You're going to be farm to table is not contained within the state, so you need to look at what pieces each state has. And then industry consolidation. When industries are consolidating right now, this is just a NAS slide of milk production going up in the last 10 years, but the number of cow operations is actually going down. So there's some geographic vulnerabilities that we need to consider, because now you have larger hubs. There are also considerations that need to be made for potential choke points or critical points of failure. Now, when the industry is getting smaller, you might have fewer facilities that do more volume. And if one facility does 80% of the volume for the state, that's a critical choke point for the system potentially. So there's reduced redundancy and maybe even reduced surge capacity. And so those are things that we need to consider when looking at food protection. This is a background of kind of how Homeland Security looks at critical infrastructure. In 2003, Presidential Directive Number 7 identified different sectors of critical infrastructure and key resources. And if you're familiar with these at all, there are things like banks and finance, dams and bridges, the electric grid. Those kinds of things are what we're considering infrastructure. The next directive, which was in 2004, that defined food and ag as critical infrastructure, established policies to defend ag and food systems against terrorist attacks, major disasters, and other emergencies. But this gave, the other agencies that are already in place for food safety kind of the charge to protect food, but it didn't give them any additional funding to do that. And as we know, all these agencies are already stretched for budgets and things like that. So what we're trying to do with this project a little bit is get food and ag into the critical infrastructure kind of categories because there's a lot of critical infrastructure funding out there that's available that food isn't currently tapping into. Every year right now, the Department of Homeland Security, HITRAC is the group, but I'm trying to watch my acronyms. We've been hanging out in DC too much, and there's a lot of acronyms that go around. It's the Homeland Infrastructure Threat and Risk Analysis Center. Every year they send out a call for data on all of the infrastructures, and in previous years, Food and Ag sent back just quite the conglomeration of things that they thought were critical. Everybody who was involved thought their part was the most critical, and then DHS got all this data and said, we don't really know what to do with it. DHS is not a food and ag organization. They said, we have no idea, and they just kind of tossed the data aside. So that's been the real problem right now. The challenges are that the HITRAC data call isn't even prepared for systems-based information. Right now, they're all set up to accept information about assets and facilities. They want to know the latitude and longitude of the bridge and if they can put gates and guards around it and those kinds of thoughts. If we are going to look at food and ag, we need to talk about subsystems because it might not be one farmer's bulk tank that's critical. It might be the subsystem of all farmers' bulk tanks that are the critical piece. Or it might even be the transportation between two facilities. And as many of you know, if we use contract haulers, what are you going to give that guy's home address, as your lat and longe? So those kinds of things didn't really add up for food and ag. Because of that, like I said, there was no consistency from the states for what they were submitting as critical infrastructure. Some states were submitting every, retail fast food place, and other states were submitting dairy hubs as their critical infrastructure for the state. And again, they had no idea how to compile this into meaningful, results. If I asked everybody in the room to give me critical infrastructure information about your state for food and ag, I'd probably get, 50 different answers, and then all it would really be is, my interpretation of your answers that became what was critical, and that's really just going to be my opinion in the first place. So we're trying to get away from all these multiple answers and every industry thinking they're the most critical component, and actually having some rhyme or reason to what we're deeming critical within the food and ag sector. Also, as we know, government and the private sector are jointly responsible for protecting critical infrastructure. This has been more of a challenge in food and ag than it has in a lot of other sectors that are private as well. Industry is concerned about, telling what parts of their system is most critical. They're talking about their vulnerabilities. They're not very willing to do that for good reasons. They're also afraid of increased regulations and different things like that. And so there's been some real challenges there, kind of bridging the gap between industry and government, especially on the Homeland Security side. Because going into this, Food and Ag is realizing right off the bat that DHS doesn't understand food and agriculture. The criteria that they were using for designating critical infrastructure did not even fit the food and ag system. Their criteria used to include things like mass evacuations for periods of time as one of the criteria. And as you know, if we have a foodborne illness, nobody's evacuating anything. And so those are the kinds of issues that we've had. And so, right. So to speak, sorry. So basically, food and ag just weren't able to fit into this model that DHS had set up, and as a result, food and ag is the only sector of the 18 as of right now that doesn't have a critical infrastructure designation on anything, which is really unacceptable. We really need to do something about that. And so, based on all of these challenges, DHS actually funded the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, the creation of this Food and Agriculture Criticality Assessment tool. And what the tool does is it allows subsystem level assessments versus assets and facilities. So we can bring people together, and we always defer to the industry in this process. Nobody knows the industry like the industry, and if we can now talk about it in a collection, we can say, what are the most critical and vulnerable points of all milking parlors for your state rather than your farm. We're not trying to get at your private proprietary information. We're not trying to let your competitors know, what you're doing that they might be doing differently. We're just trying to get an assessment of your state and what pieces are vulnerable within that subsystem. It standardizes the threat and consequence terminology for DHS. They really needed terminology that wasn't going to be changing from state to state. And, someplace we call them auction houses, someplace we call them sale barns. And those kinds of things were just not working out well for comparing state to state. And they have, this pool of funding that they want to split up, and they just weren't sure how to do that. So this tool allows us to all talk in the same terms, and all of the terms that we have associated values. They'll actually give numerical scores, so we can start to score things, which, the threat analysis people like numbers, so they really like sorting things out along those lines. But this assessment process is very process versus product driven. On our end of things, we're not looking just for the number. We actually were able to bring together very disparate groups and get them all in the same room at the same time. You have your inspectors and your large producers, small producers, vertically integrated, versus standalones, and get everybody together with the Department of Ag and Public Health and Emergency Management talking. The subject matter expertise, like I said, we're looking for ground level. We want to know who has a working knowledge of this subsystem on the ground. We don't want to be making any assumptions about what the system is made up of. We want to actually know from the industry, this is how it's done. These are, we do or don't put seals on our trucks as an industry as a whole. We do this and that. And the biosecurity measures that are in place industry-wide. Because as we know, if one company's commodity is suspect, the whole industry is affected. Just because PCA's peanut butter was affected doesn't mean that the rest of the peanut butters were fine. Consumers still, were avoiding peanut butter in general. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to address, and we can do this by looking at it from a subsystem level rather than an individual company approach. And also, there's just not funding to do vulnerability assessments on every facility, and it would be a waste of time, and it would be actually burdensome to the industry to provide, space and time for the inspectors or whoever it is to come in and do those vulnerability assessments. This lets you target it by subsystem, but then if you find out there are 3 facilities that make up 80% of that subsystem, then you can start to target things along those lines. We also look at things from an all hazards approach. This is very important. In emergency management in our company, this is always how we address things from an all hazards approach. But hazards in food and ag are much different than other critical infrastructures. Like to say, you can start a rumor that the bridge has been blown up, but then you can drive over and see if it is or is not blown up. If you start a rumor that food has been contaminated, we can't deny that it's been contaminated until we're sure, but then we can't also reassure the public in the meantime. So this one slide, which I don't know if any of you have seen it before, but I like it because obviously swine was, misinformation caused swine to be implicated incorrectly during swine flu. But this image actually someone sent me on the internet because, we didn't have a unified approach to communications during the H1N1 incident right away. And so, the void that we kind of had where CDC and WHO and CNN and everybody were saying different things. In the meantime, things like this were spreading all over the internet. A lot worse things for the pork industry also were, kind of pointing at pigs, pointing at pigs, pointing at pigs. And so we need to also kind of counteract these messages. And those can be strategies to protect this as an infrastructure. And those are very different than other infrastructures where, social media might not, help at all in protecting it. But from an all hazards approach, we need to consider things like this with misinformation that might be doing some serious damage to the industry. This is an actual picture of what, it's kind of hard to read here, of what a flowchart would look like in the tool itself. We take a very complex web and we break it down into simple components. We have, up on the top here, we have inputs, processes, and outputs. This particular one is kind of a general vegetable industry, but then we start to move boxes around and redraw it based on each state. And so you start all the way from genetics and chemical companies, fertilizers, farmers, vegetable processors, wholesale distribution, storage, retail, etc. And there are charts like this for all of the different commodity groups. And the simplicity of the tool is actually what's very unique and helpful about it, because the complex ways that we like to do things are great when you want really specific data, but when you want to just get at the ground level, like where are the vulnerabilities, what's more critical than the next, you want to be able to have a conversation that everyone can take part in. And this tool actually allowed us to kind of cut through some of the tension in the room when you get your regulators and competitors and everybody together. The simplicity of it actually allowed everybody to kind of get all of the terminology fights aside and just look at the system as a whole. So once you pick one of those subsystem boxes, this I'm looking at beef slaughter facilities, then you go down the potential threats. And we have a master list already in there. It's a drop-down kind of just point and shoot of the potential threats to that industry. And it's a comprehensive list. So pretty much in all of the 10 states that we went into, we didn't find any threats, or no one recommended any threats that we were missing. So we feel that it's a very comprehensive list. And it goes, anything from foreign animal disease to misinformation and public messaging to, loss of operating rights. These are all threats that this industry faces. And then once you have your threat list all compiled, and this isn't a comprehensive one for slaughter facilities, but I didn't want to share anyone's data, so I was just picking some boxes illustratively. Once you have those threats, then you have your all hazards. That's your all hazards. And then moving on to consequences, these are the consequences that any of those could have. So it's not, you don't have to assess all of the consequences of foreign animal disease or all of the consequences of, lost access to water. But what you do is you take all of those and then look at the potential direct consequences of them. And, we consider things like brand damage, economic loss, loss of access to capital. These are all consequences of the food and ag industry that the Department of Homeland Security needs to understand in order to protect it. It's not just the economic costs of rebuilding something if it were to get destroyed. This tool also allows us to look at the footprint of an incident and to rate things along those lines. In one state that we were in, that's a major dairy producer, they thought that their liquid milk would be, more critical than their cheese operations, just because, you think liquid milk, short shelf life, et cetera, like those kinds of assumptions. And what they actually found after doing their assessment is that their liquid milk is primarily for their school milk program, and it's almost 100% contained within the state, whereas their cheese is going to 48 states or something along those lines. So then they realized that, if something were to happen to, whatever component of that subsystem, the footprint of something, intentional or otherwise, as an inject into their fluid milk would be more contained than it would be at a different point in their system. And this tool allows you to get to those kind of conclusions based on the actual knowledge from the industry and the regulators. There's also second and third order consequences, loss of access to insurance, loss of market access is a huge one in this industry with H1N1 being called swine flu or whatever it was. We immediately lost trade, with China and Russia, and things opened up eventually, but, there's serious implications for loss of market access. And so we need to take all of those things into consideration and just kind of paint the broader picture of why food and agriculture is different than other infrastructures. Loss of access to insurance, like the peanut butter company couldn't get insurance anymore, therefore they couldn't get credit access, therefore they go out of business. Like those kinds of trickle-down effects are different for this sector than many others. We also, so like I said, we completed assessments and workshops in 10 states. These assessments, we focus primarily on one commodity chain for an assessment. You're obviously not going to be able to map out your entire food system from farm to table in one day by any means. One state, was able to get pretty darn close with their entire dairy system by breaking into work groups. But this is going to be a multi-year process. But from year to year, you're not going to have to change your assessments that much. The industry doesn't change that fast. But with some things like when we looked at sale barns and we considered that that state didn't have animal ID in place, if they were then to go back and implement animal ID, they could just change those assumptions on their assessments, and then their criticality for that system might actually come down a bit. So those kinds of considerations you can make, and from year to year, they won't change that much, but you'll want to go back and review them just a little bit and kind of change things. And there's place for comments and kind of telling the narrative of why you made the selections that you did. DHS, as of about 3 weeks ago, has decided that all states are expected to use this food and ag criticality assessment tool as the way to go forward. It's a very grassroots kind of movement that the states and industry were saying that, we want to be able to tell our story, and they finally came up with a good way after piloting it in many states over many years to get it to where the industry was happy with it, and that was really our goal. And so now, DHS has signed on and said this is how we're going to do things, and this is how we're going to accept data from states on food and agriculture. And their criteria have been adjusted to fit food and ag now. So now there's an economic impact. There is the loss of the, if you could potentially lose the subsystem, or if it takes the subsystem so long to recover. And then there's a deaths and casualties component too, which has definitely changed how High Track will look at food and ag from now on, because now it allows food and ag to say that, in a case of a foreign animal disease, you're not going to maybe have any human fatalities, but you're going to have such a big impact on our economy that those kinds of things need to be considered. Even if you only have one animal that gets implicated in like BSE, you're still going to have this huge impact on the industry and all these different things. And so it allows us to tell our story better as food and ag, and what should be considered and what the impacts of misinformation and all these different things are on this sector versus other sectors. Our next steps are going to be additional assessments in these states. We'd like to continue this process, and this is kind of my commercial, but we'd like to get industry involved. So I think someone yesterday said if you're not telling your story, someone will tell it for you. We really, really want to bring industry to the table. They're the key player in these assessments. I think 26 states are doing these assessments this year, and will continue to do them in future years. And so if you'd like to, share your voice, I'd love to know who you are and hook you up with that contact from your state that's doing this. And now that funding is associated with this for infrastructure protection money, I'm pretty sure all states will, be on board eventually if they're not currently. And then, like I said, you can prioritize your limited resources, target risk reduction strategies. If one of the, areas that is critical is the transportation between two facilities, and something like electronic locks is obviously cost prohibitive, those could be places where you could target a risk reduction strategy, because DHS has a lot of funding for infrastructure protection. It can't be given directly to the private sector, but they can do these kind of broad programs that will subsidize some of the things that we can do to buy down risk. And this process actually allows us to come up with industry-based solutions. It allows us to have the industry come up with what would buy down those risks, rather than someone coming in and doing a risk assessment and creating buffer protection zones and these kinds of things that are traditionally associated with homeland security measures. And then we're also excited about continuing to strengthen public-private partnerships. What we found is these meetings are just a wonderful forum to get everybody talking in kind of a no-fault, low-stress environment. The only time some people see their regulators is when they're regulating kind of thing. This is to get everybody together and getting them talking. And it really gives industry, kind of the guest of honor position, and that's what we've found. And it's really great to have everybody on the same page and to get industry to tell their story in an environment where they're not going to be afraid of increased regulation or more people, coming to inspect their farms, because they already have enough of that going on in many cases.